Welcome for joining us again with the Formed Book Club. This is Joseph Fessio, S.J. in San Francisco. I'm missing my trusty sidekick. She's trusty, but she's also self-isolating here in San Francisco as we are taking extraordinary measures to prevent any viral infections taking place. And we pray each day for Mass for the 3,000 people who've died from abortion on this day and the 15 people who died from the COVID ID virus. We also have with us Joseph Pearce from South Carolina. He's been self-quarantined for several years now.
I make a habit of it. Nothing's changed in this house.
So, Joseph, anything you want to say before we get going here?
Well, no, I would. I don't know exactly where we finished, but I'd like to actually take up the cudgels, so to speak, on page 45. And up to a point, they are cudgels because I want to seek a point of clarification at the beginning, so that we're talking about things here. So may I fire?
You may. I believe we actually had concluded that first chapter last week. But that's okay. We can go back to it.
Okay.
And with Cardinal Sarah, who has written the second chapter, I find so many things that I want to quote that we may not get through this session anyway. So go ahead, Joseph, page 45.
Yeah, this is all I have on this chapter before moving on to the next one. But I just want to clarify something. So the one full paragraph on that page, about halfway down that paragraph, in the New Testament, this privation is transformed and renewed. Priests, because they are radically consecrated to God, renounce marriage and family. The Church interpreted the word clergy in this sense. To enter the clergy means to renounce a self-centered life and to accept God alone as the support and guarantee of one's own life. Now, what I want to just clarify there is I have no problem at all with any of that, except the suggestion, and obviously I don't want to ever question Pope Benedict, that if one has a vocation for marriage, one has adopted a self-centered life, which is clearly not what he means, and it's not necessarily the case, of course.
Right, and I think possibly both marriage and the clerical state are ways of renouncing a self-centered life, and even if those, for good reason, don't have a vocation to religious life or the priesthood, and while called to matrimony, circumstances prevent them finding the right person to marry, and they live in the single state, which is not a true state of life, it doesn't mean they're self-centered.
Right.
So we all have to become eccentric in the sense of standing outside of ourselves. And one way to do that is matrimony, and within matrimony, having children. That definitely will do it. And the other way is religious life or the priesthood, yes.
Yeah, but the other thing that's necessary with the religious life, when we talk about celibacy, it needs to be married to, being a holy matrimony with chastity. And I think it's the fact that, the celibate clergy, many of them had ditched the idea of chastity, that we've had all of the problems that we've seen over the last 20 years. And, that's the one thing, is that the celibate life is only a life of self-sacrifice if it's also a life of chastity.
That's right. And I actually link part of this problem to a change in the albs which priests use, because the older traditional album, when I try to use when I can, I do have it here, has a cincture that you put on separately. And with that cincture, there's a prayer that our loins be girded, and that temptation be avoided, and that we grow in the virtue of chastity and continence. Beautiful prayer, which every priest who uses a cincture ought to be praying before every Mass. And I think that might have helped. But the new albs, they have the Velcro thing at the top here, and a little Velcro tab around the waist. It replaces the cincture, but I'm afraid they've replaced the prayer too. So
yeah,
I agree.
That's an example of technology leading us astray, Father.
There it is.
Who needs Velcro? Huh?
Yeah. All right. Let's see. Well, so is that all you have on the chapter 1 then?
That's all I have left on chapter 1, yes.
Okay, well, we move to chapter 2, which is Cardinal Seurat, and called Loving to the End, an ecclesiological and pastoral look at priestly celibacy. And this is really a perfect complement. These two people are friends, and they share things spiritually, but they're different and have different backgrounds, different strengths. And certainly, Pope Benedict gave us a very condensed version of a theology of the priesthood, and also an exegesis, which is at the root of that theology, which sees the Old Testament in a Christological, pneumatological, or spiritual sense way. And now, Cardinal Seurat is going to add to that the pastoral aspect and also the ecclesiastical one. So really, the two together make a wonderful, wonderful book. I'm not going to quote anything on page 66, but he does there, Cardinal Seurat, he points out what his method is going to be. He's going to take three different aspects here, or consequences, of abandoning priestly celibacy. One, a pastoral catastrophe, the word he uses. Two, ecclesiological confusion. And three, obscuring our understanding of the priesthood. Those are his three main subheadings here in this chapter. But on page 66, I want to point out just under the subheading itself is a subheading in italics where he says the priesthood, an ontological entrance into the yes of Christ the priest. That pretty much says it all. And that word ontological is very important. Benedict uses it. Now Seurat uses it. The priesthood is not just a function. It's not just a job. It's not just a part-time thing. It is entering into the full dedication of Christ the priest for his people, into a nuptial relationship. That comes through again and again in this chapter.
Father, bearing in mind that we have a viewership here who, like me, are not trained philosophers, would you like to define for the more ignorant amongst us what the word ontological actually means?
All right, well, it comes from the Greek word ontos, which is being, and that means it's not psychological, it's not emotional, it's not occupational or professional. The priesthood is something rooted in the being of Christ and the being of the priest, and a sharing in that same being. So ontological, to say something's ontologically related, that's the closest you can get.
Yeah, okay.
But I know you knew that. But you want to ask the question for the benefit of others who may not.
Oh, thank you, Father.
Very, very kind of you. So I want to then jump from page 66 onto page 67, where this word occurs again at the top of the paragraph that begins at the beginning of the page. A consistent priestly life ontologically requires celibacy. That's another one of those pithy statements that he makes, but there's so much packed in there. A consistent priestly life, that is, a priestly life which is consistent with the very nature of the priestly life, is in its very being ontologically requires celibacy. And of course, he develops this through the book. We don't want these discussions, Joseph, to be a replacement for people reading the book and discussing it among themselves either. So, let's remind people, we haven't done it for a long, long time. There is a forum for the Forum Book Club where you can ask questions, make comments, and interact with each other. And I should have reminded myself how to get to that forum.
Formed Book Club Forum.ignatius.com, Father.
That's it. Say that again, please.
Formed Book Club Forum.ignatius.com.
Okay, .ignatius.com. Okay, that's good. I'll go try that when this is over. Make sure I can figure out myself how to do
I
it.
have my uses, you know.
Okay. I want to cite something on page 70. Joseph, do you have something before that?
My next one is page 75, so no, it's all yours.
All right. Well, several times in his chapter, Cardinal Sarah refers to his experience as a young priest and even as a boy growing up in Africa. It's very touching. It's very moving. Here's one on page 70. How many times, while walking for long hours between the villages, with a briefcase altar on my head, imagine that. You see these African people walk with jugs on their head, whatever. Here's this young priest with his mass kit, his briefcase altar on his head under the blazing sun. I myself experienced the joy of self-giving for the church bride. What a lovely image that is.
Yeah, and I also this to me is one of the strongest arguments is that those of us that are married, you quite clearly you devote your life under God, of course, to protecting your wife and children, to raising your children, to growing in holiness that they may become holy. And this obviously takes your time. If you want a priesthood that can devote themselves and sacrifice themselves entirely, in toto, to the church, they need to be freed from those other responsibilities. Otherwise, that divisiveness is actually going to militate against their ability to be able to be priests.
And we'll see that coming up later in this chapter. I got some citations from Carlos Ra on that very point. On page 72, again, speaking of his experience, he says, as a son of Africa, I cannot in conscience support the idea that people who are being evangelized should be deprived of this encounter with the priesthood that is fully lived out. The peoples of Amazonia have the right to a full experience of Christ the bridegroom. We cannot offer them second-class priests. You know, there's a kind of a freshness and a directness that comes out of Africa.
Yes.
I'm not saying he's not sophisticated, because he is. He's a very erudite person, but he simply calls a spade a spade. I guess spades are black, right? So that's something you would normally do.
I mean, it's that paradox. My biography of Chesterton, wisdom and innocence. The wisdom of Father Brown and the innocence of Father Brown. These aren't contradictory. So there is a healthy, good innocence that comes out of Africa, which is not devoid of or divorced from wisdom. On the contrary, they retain an innocence that those in the decadent, old, and dying West have lost. And that's why what they say sounds so fresh, because they have an innocence that we have lost.
On page 74, again, a personal anecdote. He says, I imagine what the evangelization of my village would have been like if a married man had been ordained a priest there. The thought of it wrenches my heart. What sadness. I certainly would not be a priest today, because the radical character of the missionary's life is what attracted me. And then he tells more about that in his book. Which book? The Day is Now Far Spent, I think, or maybe it's even his earlier book, God or Nothing, where his parents became Catholics because of these priests that they saw in their little village. He was already 2 years old when that happened. But then he, as he grew up, saw their dedication, saw them praying, saw them living a life of celibacy, and that's what drew him to the priesthood.
I would say also, Father, I mean, obviously I come from a very different background in all sorts of ways from Cardinal Sarah, but part of the attraction for me for the church, obviously wasn't the overarching one, was the fact that there was a priesthood, and the whole idea of the priesthood is that the priests had sacrificed themselves entirely in their marriage to the bride, the church, and they were giving themselves wholly. They weren't being divided in their loyalties. They were in it 100%. And that was something that I thought was special about the Catholic Church. You didn't see the Anglican Church, where you did get the impression the vicar was just another job. You've got the plumber, you've got the gardener, you've got the carpenter, you've got the vicar, right? I mean, they're just jobs, and they all got families and wives. There's no suggestion that there's something ontologically different about the priesthood.
Yes. Again, on page 74, this relates to the Amazon question that came up in 2019. Some have exploited and hardened the opposition between, quote, pastoral care by visit, close quotes, and, quote, pastoral care of presence, close quote. That is the difference between a priest who visits from time to time and someone who's actually there. The visit to a community by a missionary priest who has come from a distant land expresses the solicitude of the universal church. It is the image of the Word visiting humanity. The ordination of a married man in the midst of the community would express the opposite movement, as if each community were bound to find the means of salvation within itself. So he sees the positive side here of missionaries coming. You said page 75 you have something on?
Yeah, the bottom paragraph there, going over to page 76, if I may read it. It's not there
Sure.
anymore. It's not the whole paragraph either. I am persuaded that the Christian communities of Amazonia themselves do not think along the lines of Eucharistic demands. I think rather that these topics are obsessions that stem from theological milieu at universities. They are dealing with ideologies developed by a few theologians, or rather sorcerers' apprentices, who wish to utilize the distress of poor peoples as an experimental laboratory for their clever plans. I cannot resolve to be silent and let them do so. I want to take up the defense of the poor, the little ones, these people who have no voice. And I think this is an important point because, this is not because the people of the Amazon are demanding married clergy to meet their needs. This is the people of the Amazon being used as a political football to be kicked around by modernists in the church as a way of pursuing their agenda. And there's a very important difference here, which is why you then have this African cardinal who's actually in solidarity with the people in the Amazonia and defending them, because this is not what they've asked for. It's not what they want. They're being used in very much a patronizing way by decadent Western elites just to further a particular modernist agenda. And I think this is key for us to understand this.
And now he turns to the objection that people will make to what you said, what he said, what I'm saying. But but the church has always had married priests. This is tradition from going back to the apostles themselves. On that same page 76 of that new section there called In Light of Church Tradition, he says, some will tell me that priestly celibacy is only a discipline that was imposed at a late date by the Latin Church on her clerics. Historical honesty obliges me to declare that they are false. And then I want to point out the footnote on this page because he refers to 3 books. All 3, I'm happy to say, are published by Ignatius Press in their English versions. Christian Coccini, The Apostolic Origins of Priestly Celibacy, Alphonse Maria Cardinal Stickler, The Case for Clerical Celibacy, and Stefan Hyde, Celibacy in the Early Church. And all of them make clear that there was never a married clergy in the sense of a man and a wife living as man and wife engaging in conjugal relations. Whenever a married man was ordained to any of the clerical states, deacon, priest, or bishop, the wife had to agree, and they lived continently from that point on. So he kind of develops the idea here. I think people can read that on their own. I want to go to page 79, unless you have something before that.
Well, I have something on page 79 as well. You go first, and if
well, actually, I probably have what you have, so you go first.
Okay. What I have is the top half, the bottom half of that top paragraph.
Yes, exactly.
In Vatican Council II, brought out the dignity of the sacrament of matrimony as the proper path to sanctity through conjugal life. This state of life presupposes, however, that the spouses place the bond that unites them above all else. To ordain a married man a priest would amount to diminishing the dignity of marriage and reducing the priesthood to a job. I think that really does sum up what I was trying to say less articulately earlier.
Right, and that was exactly what I was going to quote as well. The beautiful complementarity of the priesthood and marriage, both rooted in Christ as the bridegroom in love with his church, the bride. And so there's something nuptial in marriage, obviously, but also in the priesthood and in Christ himself as the root of both. And this is one reason I think, Joseph, we have all these controversies today. Almost every controversy inside the Catholic Church has to do with the man-woman complementarity and sexual relations. If it's a contraception, it's abortion, it's transgenderism, it's divorce, it is ordination of women, you name it. It's the loss of awareness of God's created order, male and female, both for marriage and for the church and the priesthood. I mean,
which is why the way I began this particular session with, for both married people, husbands and wives, and priests, chastity is essential. Now, you can have conjugal relations with your wife and still be chaste. I mean, it's not that that conjugal relations means a lack of chastity. If you're indulging in pornography or pornographic fantasies, you are not chaste. You can have a relationship with your wife that is chaste and conjugal. But the important thing is chastity, and the absence of chastity, whether it's in marriage or the priesthood, is destructive.
I hate to just be an amen corner here, but, you're saying what he's saying, and I'm saying what he's saying, and we're both agreeing with each other as well as with him. One little point I'll just refer to on bottom of page 79, he talks about the churches of the East, because that's another objection. Well, in the East, they have married priests, yes. And he very clearly states here what is not widely known. It's based on a mistake. 691, Council of Trullo. There was a forgery of Paphnutius. There was intentional fake news on the African canons that were mistranslated. And so the whole thing was a mistake. And God somehow, will put up with our mistakes for a long, long time. And he's done this one for, 700 from 1400 years. But we don't have to make it in the West. I got something on page 82.
Yeah, I basically up to page 99 where we decided we were going to finish this session. I have nothing after 79.
Oh, okay. Well,
I'll just interject as appropriate. Or
that
otherwise.
Sounds good. Let's do that. Page 82 at the bottom. This just kind of restates what we've been saying. Without the presence of the celibate priest, the church can no longer become aware that she is the bride of Christ. Priestly celibacy, far from being merely an ascetical discipline, is necessary to the identity of the church. And that whole idea of the church as bride and mother has been lost. In the Middle Ages, the most commented book of Scripture was not even the New Testament. It was the Song of Songs. Why? Because it expressed as a really secular love poem that was adapted by the Jewish people to express God's relation to his people. And so it's very, very deep. It's just not a disciplinary thing, That's 82. 86 brings up that same point. And here it relates it to marriage. Top of the page. A church that had no experience of being loved by celibate priests would end up no longer grasping the nuptial meaning of all sanctity. That's a great phrase, the nuptial meeting of all sanctity. Indeed, priestly celibacy and marriage go hand in hand. If the one is called into question, the other fails. Priests point out to spouses the meaning of the total gift. Spouses, by their conjugal life, point out to priests the meaning of their celibacy. That really ought to be made into a banner. You got banners in church, put that one up,
Very good.
Not just a bunch of balloons and things. Going on to page 93. Just to point out in the footnote there, here he talks about the fact that the deaconesses of the ancient church were not ordained to the clerical state. They performed a service, especially when baptism was by immersion and women were naked. They didn't want the bishop anointing the woman, so the women came to do that behind a veil. But the book he points out to here is called Deaconesses, an Historical Study by Aimé Georges Martimore. That also is an Ignatius Press book. So if you want to learn more about these critical issues, go to ignatius.com. my final, I got a couple more here. Oh, this is really good. 95. What do we do about these countries where there aren't no priests? They have that in Africa, they've got it in South America. He again goes back to his own experience. I recalled my years as a young bishop in a diocese in which priests were few in number. I had determined then that the essential element of my missionary work would have to be to strengthen the formation of catechists. That is to say, to bring into communion with himself men and women well formed in their faith who could bring the faith to others, including the non-Catholics, and be missionaries. What a beautiful example that was, and it's worked. I mean, that's one reason Africa now is thriving as a church.
Yeah, I would say one thing there is just that obviously it's not ideal. I know that as a Catholic, we can all feel now the deprivation of the Holy Eucharist.
Yes.
For the first time, since I became a Catholic, I did not go to church on Sunday. And we set up pews in the living room, and we made a little altar, and we did the best we could to replicate as far as possible. But there was no genuflection because there was no tabernacle. Right. So obviously, this is he's talking about.
I'll bet there was a long homily though.
Yeah, actually, our priest, thanks be to God, always gives good homilies. But the thing is, this is how do you cope in the absence of priests? But it's not ideal. But the point is, what you don't do in a crisis is do something which is actually going to be destructive in the long term out of panic. So so in other words, this is preferable to the alternative being suggested, but the ideal is more good, solid, celibate priestly vocation.
That's right. And Jesus says, the field is ripe for the harvest. Pray, therefore, that laborers will be sent into the harvest. He also mentions this experience in Japan, which is pretty well known, but I think it's good to be reminded of it. Page 97. After the Jesuits went to Japan and were expelled and martyred, there were 2 centuries that Japan was without priests. But he says here, each generation of the Christians in Japan taught the 3 signs by which they would recognize the return of the priests among them. Quote, they will be celibate, they'll have a statue of Mary, they will obey the Pope of Rome, close quotes. So for 200 years, they kept the faith in that way. Finally, on page 99, this is our last page for today, this week.
Could I jump in?
Oh, yeah, sure.
I obviously left you astray. I do actually have something on page 98, if I may.
Sure.
Just noticed it when I turned the page there. So middle of the page, I was able to visit Christian communities that for 30 years had not had the Eucharist nor seen a priest, but remained firm in the faith and were dynamic communities led by the catechist, which is a fundamental ministry in Africa, and by other ministers, evangelizers, prayer leaders, and pastoral care women, service to the poorest. I mean, all very good vocations in themselves, the laity can take a lead in. So again, I thought that was inspiring.
Well, I myself was in Siberia for several months, and I was exiled there by my superiors for my further formation. And I was in Novosibirsk, which was a wonderful Jesuit bishop, Bishop Joseph Pearce. He's still there, living in very impoverished circumstances. But I was to go out to this village, Bolchika, which is miles and miles and miles through the tundra from Novosibirsk, to spend Easter week with a community that hadn't seen a priest for 30 years.
Wow.
But they had a house that was dedicated as a chapel. They would come there for readings on Sunday. They kept the faith. And it was, telling you, what an experience it was to be there with those people who were so overjoyed to see a priest for the first time in 30 years.
Yeah.
Finally, then on page 99, top of the page, from the ecclesiological perspective, therefore, the ordination of married men would produce a true confusion about the states of life. It would obscure the meaning of marriage and would weaken the apostolate of the baptized. It would prevent the church from understanding herself as the dearly beloved bride of Christ, will result in confusion about the true place of women within the church. I mean, this man has such clarity and such wisdom.
And courage.
And courage, too, yes. So that's the first half of chapter 2, which is, and then next week we'll finish the book, the second half of chapter 2, and the little conclusion at the end there. But basically what we've seen here with Cardinal Sarah is he's talking about the first two issues that he's focusing on in his chapter. One, the pastoral danger and catastrophes, he calls it, of ordaining married men as priests. And number two, the ecclesiological confusion that would result. Next week, we'll talk about the obscurity of the priesthood. And then, after that, we hope we'll have Vivian back with us to talk about sex, right? Read the title for us, Joseph.
Our next book, so next week, as Father has already said, we'll conclude our discussion from the depths of our hearts. And then the following week, we'll commence our next book, which is Sex and the Catholic Feminist, which I'm holding up there, by very well-known former arch feminist Sue Ellen Browder, who's now a convert to the faith. And the subtitle is New Choices for a New Generation. So it's a wonderful, very recently published earlier this year, work on the issue of pro-life. And I think it will be something that I'm looking forward to discussing. So go out and buy that. It's jointly published by Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute. So you can purchase your copy now so you can start reading. And we'll give the reading assignment for the first of those sessions next week.
Very good. Thank you, Joseph. Thanks all for listening and watching. God bless you all, and hope